So Tom Parker Bowles finds himself at the heart of a tale where Prince William supposedly called for an arrest. And the entire narrative rests upon a piece of paper that quite simply lacks its second page now. That is precisely where our journey begins. Not with idle gossip, nor with flashy headlines, but with the stark reality that the single document capable of clearing everything up is unfinished, and the missing half seemingly vanished from Windsor Castle 2 days prior to anyone raising questions. That is no wild conspiracy theory. It is merely a deficient file resting inside a royal archive. Truthfully, the fact that nobody has bothered to explain where the remainder went is the most peculiar part. Before we dive into all of this, if you love watching us unpack royal drama the way it actually played out rather than the way the news wants you to think it happened, hit that subscribe button. We delve into these stories on a weekly basis, and you will definitely want to be around for what happens next. The whispers began well before dawn, rippling through palace corridors much faster than any official statement ever could manage. By the time members of staff were turning up for their early shifts, the conversation had already homed in on a single sentence supposedly uttered by Prince William himself. Have him locked up immediately. No official announcement ever verified those words. Not a single palace spokesperson repeated them. No transcript is anywhere to be found. Yet the rumor spread regardless, acting just like rumors always do when they carry enough intrigue. Within hours, the name linked to the startling claim had shocked pretty much everyone keeping track of the story. It was not some senior royal figure. It was not a government minister either. It was not even an official working inside the palace. The finger of suspicion pointed straight at Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son, a well-regarded food writer and broadcaster who had carved out a completely independent career away from royal duties. The accusation alleged that King Charles's private estate had been utilized without proper permission. Suddenly, everyone inside the palace found themselves in a mad scramble. What made this explosive claim so powerful was not merely the suggestion that someone close to the royal family had overstepped the mark. It was the precise nature of the charge itself. The private estates belonging to King Charles are not simply historic tourist spots that the family pops into at weekends. They are privately managed properties governed by very strict administrative rules, where entry is controlled through formal procedures rather than casual family arrangements. You cannot simply turn up alongside a few mates and a handful of commercial vans and treat the grounds like a holiday rental. There are visitor logs, security checkpoints, clearance codes, and an entire system built to monitor precisely who goes into each property and at what time. Therefore, when a member of the estate team reportedly spotted oddities in the visitor records linked to a past private gathering, it did not seem particularly dramatic or scandalous at first glance. The paperwork appeared entirely standard. Vehicle movements looked routine. Guest arrivals blended seamlessly with countless lawful visits logged across many months. Yet one minor administrative detail stubbornly refused to fit into the rest of the file. That single discrepancy sparked an internal inquiry that supposedly blew up into something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. Here is where the timeline starts getting properly fascinating. According to the rumors whispering among palace employees and royal commentators, what started out as a straightforward plea for clarification blossomed into a wider investigation covering authorization records, communication logs, and estate booking protocols. Each document answered a single query while simultaneously spawning 2 new ones. Instead of putting the matter to bed, every page seemed to deepen the confusion over what had actually transpired. Outside the fortress walls of the palace, the general public remained completely oblivious. Television crews kept recording tourists lingering outside Buckingham Palace. Guards maintained their ceremonial duties with flawless precision. Visitors beamed for photographs, totally unaware that advisors inside were reportedly locked in debate over a matter that could test personal loyalties at the very peak of the monarchy. Prince William allegedly received an early briefing summarizing the growing anxiety. No official transcript has ever seen the light of day, and much of what happened next remains rooted in informed speculation rather than proven public fact. Even so, several royal commentators later insisted that William's reaction was instant and unyielding. If the rules safeguarding the king's private property had been broken, he supposedly believed the situation demanded a thorough investigation regardless of who might get caught in the crossfire. For William, duty always comes before personal comfort. Throughout his public life, He has consistently championed accountability, stability, and safeguarding the institution he is destined to lead one day. Supporters argue this reputation is precisely why reports of potential rule-breaking, however delicate they might be, would never be brushed aside without meticulous examination. Meanwhile, attention slowly shifted towards Tom Parker Bowles. He had spent years forging a respected career as a food writer and broadcaster, entirely separate from any royal associations. Yet his connection to Queen Camilla meant every single public outing was watched through a completely different filter. Ordinary invitations suddenly drew intense scrutiny. Harmless social gatherings turned into major news headlines. In that sort of atmosphere, telling fact from fiction becomes virtually impossible. As the speculation ramped up, competing stories began swirling around London's media circles. One version argued that the whole controversy stemmed from an innocent mix-up regarding estate permissions. Another hinted at internal friction that had simmered for months while remaining hidden to dodge unnecessary public embarrassment. A third, far more dramatic account claimed that confidential files painted a much darker picture. None of those rival claims ever received official verification. Even so, each one gathered momentum as palace officials maintained their heavy silence. Behind that wall of quietness lay another puzzle that few outsiders could ever hope to solve. Why had nobody spoken out publicly to clear the air? Seasoned royal reporters pointed out that the palace frequently declines to comment on internal administrative matters, especially when private estates are involved. That policy, designed to maintain confidentiality, often lets speculations spiral out of control. And that is precisely what occurred right there inside a secure office. According to insider accounts that have never been independently verified, several thick folders were laid across a polished wooden conference table. Estate registers, access records, internal memos, and approval guidelines. Each file represented another puzzle piece that stubbornly refused to offer easy solutions. Advisors supposedly looked over every single page with extreme care, well aware that one missed detail could alter the entire path of the inquiry. Then the review struck something that changed the game completely. The heavy doors of the estate administration office at Sandringham House clicked shut, and a hefty folder landed right in the middle of the table with a dull thud. Pages scattered across the dark timber, revealing rows upon rows of computer-printed access logs, handwritten gate sign-offs, and time-stamped security camera transcripts. The senior estate manager instructed everyone present to study the entry dates and then compare them against the official clearance register for that exact same weekend. The mismatch was glaring and undeniable. On 3 separate occasions over the previous 6 months, heavy commercial transport and private guests had gained entry to restricted zones within the king's private lands. They had slipped through security checkpoints during hours when the estate was formally listed as closed to all non-essential personnel. The signatures granting entry did not belong to the estate warden. They did not belong to the head of security either. The authorization code attached to the electronic barrier logs matched a private administrative profile that should never have held the power to override royal security protocols. Legal advisors exchanged quiet, uneasy glances across the room. Nobody dared to utter the name aloud, but it hung heavily in the air like an invisible weight. The administrative profile in question had been set up during a routine departmental update and was tied to an internal reference code directly linked to communications managed through Tom Parker Bowles's private liaison office. What had started as a quiet administrative check was no longer an isolated mystery. The review was spreading, reaching into every nook and cranny of the royal property management system. Within hours, teams of auditors were quietly dispatched to multiple sites across Sandringham, Balmoral, and the administrative quarters of Windsor Castle. Filing cabinets were unlocked, and server archives hauled out for inspection. Correspondence files covering nearly 2 years were spread out across long tables. Access logs were cross-checked against fuel receipts, catering delivery records, and private maintenance requests. The deeper the auditors dug, the messier the overall picture became. Different factions within the palace infrastructure immediately began to fracture. On one side stood the traditionalists, veteran estate administrators who had served the crown for decades back under Queen Elizabeth II. To them, the records represented an unforgivable breach of protocol. The rules governing the monarch's private land were absolute, deeply rooted in law and constitutional precedent. If private individuals, no matter how closely tied to the royal family by marriage, were exploiting royal assets or handing out unauthorized access to outsiders, it undermined the very foundations of the Crown's private governance. On the other side stood advisors backing the modernizing vision of the current reign. They argued fiercely behind closed doors that the entire debacle was being blown wildly out of proportion. They maintained that the anonymous logs were nothing more than administrative oversight, born from blurred lines during the chaotic handover of power following the late Queen's passing. From their perspective, informal arrangements had simply been misread by overzealous staff members eager to hunt for scandals where none existed. The argument grew so fierce during one late afternoon briefing that an advisor supposedly gathered his papers, stood up, and stormed out of the room, leaving the legal team to deliberate in absolute silence. Prince William, keeping tabs on the situation through daily updates, reportedly refused to accept vague reassurances. Those close to the Prince of Wales painted a picture of a man utterly uncompromising when it came to institutional rules. William knew the public mood had shifted dramatically. Modern society demanded complete transparency, and any hint that private royal estates were being treated as personal playgrounds for non-working relatives could prove devastating to the monarchy's standing. He supposedly laid down the law to his legal team with crystal clarity. There would be no sweeping matters under the carpet. There would be no quietly rebranding security breaches as mere clerical errors just to save face. Every single log entry had to be accounted for. Every signature needed verification. If unauthorized access had indeed taken place, the unvarnished truth had to be recorded no matter whose name popped up in the report. Yet, as the investigation widened, the evidence stubbornly resisted simple conclusions. For every piece of paper suggesting an improper bypass of authority, another record popped up that seemed to contradict it. An email thread revealed an estate manager discussing venue plans weeks ahead of one of the disputed dates, implying that someone somewhere had known about the visits. But the formal approval form, which was the legal document required by estate bylaws, was completely missing from the physical archive. Had the paperwork been misplaced by careless staff, or had it been deliberately withheld? The psychological strain inside the palace walls was palpable. Longtime colleagues who had worked side by side for years began eyeing one another with quiet suspicion. Hallway chats died down the instant an outsider walked past. The silence inside the palace was no longer peaceful, it was a defensive shield holding back a brewing storm of gossip that threatened to spill into the public domain at any moment. Then came the breakthrough that altered the entire course of the review. An analyst digging through an archived database of internal memos stumbled across a misfiled document dating back 18 months. It was a confidential administrative directive signed not by an estate manager, but originating directly from a senior private secretary's desk. The memo outlined a secondary framework for estate permissions, one that directly clashed with the official legal guidelines governing the monarch's private property. The auditors sat back in their chairs, staring at the screen in utter disbelief. This single document did not solve the mystery, it blew it wide open. It suggested that the conflicting authorizations were not the result of a rogue decision or a simple misunderstanding by Tom Parker Bowles's office. Instead, it pointed towards a deeply embedded, hidden rift in how authority had been defined within royal households following the transition of the crown. The legal team was summoned back to the room instantly. Finding that memorandum meant the investigation could no longer be brushed off as a local estate issue. It was a systemic crisis of governance touching on the very boundaries of royal authority, private privilege, and legal accountability. The paper resting on the table proved that someone high up in the palace hierarchy had authorized a parallel system of control. That confidential memo now pushed investigators towards an even bigger, far more dangerous question: who had given the order to set up that secret channel of authority in the first place? The private meeting that followed was called under strict conditions of absolute secrecy. No official minutes were being jotted down by standard secretarial staff. Only the most trusted inner circle of advisors was allowed inside the room. Prince William stood by the tall window looking out over the private gardens, his hands clenched tightly behind his back, his shoulders rigid with anger. Across the table, two senior legal advisors sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the open red leather binder resting between them. William's voice was terrifyingly quiet when he spoke, demanding to know how a parallel directive could exist entirely without his knowledge. The senior legal counsel adjusted his spectacles with a shaking hand and explained that the paper seemed to have been drafted during the administrative transition period, filed away in a private internal registry that did not normally report to the main estate governance council. That explanation did little to cool the rising temperature. On the table lay 3 distinct documents side by side. The first was the original Estate Governance Act, which explicitly stated that all non-monarchic users of private royal land required direct written consent from the sovereign's official estate stewards. The second was the security log revealing multiple entries by individuals tied to Tom Parker Bowles's associates. The third was the newly discovered internal memo, which purported to grant overridden administrative permissions under a broad, vaguely worded clause concerning family hospitality. The clash between the 3 papers was complete, absolute, and dangerous. If the secondary directive held legal weight, the visits were technically sanctioned, meaning no crime had occurred. However, if that directive proved to be an unratified private arrangement stitched together without proper constitutional authority, every single entry made under its rules constituted an unlawful trespass on royal property. The psychological weight pressing down on the palace leadership was immense. The advisors were caught in an impossible trap. Validating the secondary memo meant admitting that private royal estates were being run through secret, informal channels that bypassed official oversight. Tearing it up, on the other hand, meant exposing non-working family members to potential legal scrutiny and public disgrace. Meanwhile, beyond the heavy oak doors, the media storm was gathering pace. Broadcast vans lined up along the mall. Telephoto lenses were trained continuously on the private entrances, snapping every arrival and departure of senior legal personnel. Speculation exploded across digital platforms and international news networks. Journalists dropped heavy hints about a high-level rift between royal households, openly questioning whether the management of King Charles's private wealth was undergoing an undisclosed emergency investigation. Inside the meeting, William's frustration continued to mount as conflicting accounts of private conversations came to light. One senior official claimed King Charles had given verbal approval for informal access procedures months prior, wishing to accommodate family members without burdening them with red tape. Another advisor firmly denied this, insisting the monarch had never sanctioned any departure from strict statutory protocols and was entirely oblivious to the secondary directive's existence. That contradiction exposed a deeper, far more unsettling truth about the monarchy. The institution was wrestling with its own identity, caught awkwardly between the old world of informal royal privilege and modern demands for total legal transparency. For William, the issue went way beyond administrative tweaks or family peace. It struck at the very foundations of his future reign. If rules could be bent for relatives today, the integrity of the entire monarchy would be compromised tomorrow. He reportedly demanded a complete, unvarnished accounting of every single person who had viewed, approved, or acted upon the hidden memo. Yet the harder the legal team pushed for clear answers, the more slippery the truth became. Staff members questioned about the document offered cagey, careful replies designed to shield their own backs. Written correspondence from that era was frustratingly sparse, consisting of cryptic email chains pointing towards private phone calls and offline chats. It felt as though whoever had cooked up the secondary framework had deliberately left behind a trail of breadcrumbs leading everywhere and nowhere all at once. By late evening, the sitting room was thick with exhaustion and unspoken dread. The legal advisors sat surrounded by towers of historical estate charters, constitutional texts, and modern privacy laws. The question was no longer simply about who had stepped onto royal grounds or signed a security log. The mystery had ballooned into a high-stakes turf war for authority inside the royal household itself. Just as the meeting teetered on the edge of adjourning without a firm resolution, a gentle knock rapped against the door. A junior clerk slipped into the silent room holding a small ribbon-tied leather dossier freshly pulled from the deepest archive vaults underneath Windsor Castle. The clerk laid the dossier on the mahogany table right in front of Prince William. The legal advisors leaned forward, faces drained of color, holding their breath in total quiet. One final document lay hidden inside that sealed folder, an original piece of correspondence kept secret for over a decade, holding the power to decide whether this explosive row was merely a clumsy admin error, an ethical betrayal, or something far worse. King Charles stood up from his desk, turning his back on the assembled advisors to gaze out into the darkening palace courtyard. The silence inside the private study was suffocating. On the desk behind him, the unsealed, ribbon-tied dossier lay open, its yellowed pages revealing an administrative precedent nobody in the room had foreseen. The internal review had reached its absolute endpoint. There were no more archives to plunder, no more server logs to dig up, and no more legal opinions to ask for. The full scale of the audit was now laid bare across the table, trapping the monarch, his heir, and their legal counsel in a web of their own making. The king's voice sounded quiet and heavy with profound fatigue as he remarked that they could not undo past assumptions, only decide how the crown moved forward from that night onwards. The final conclusions of the internal inquiry did not back up the sensational criminal claims swirling across social media and tabloid front pages. There was no grand conspiracy, no stolen fortune, and no proven illegal operation running within the grounds of Sandringham or Windsor. Even so, the reality uncovered by the investigation proved far more damaging to the inner foundations of the monarchy in many ways. The review demonstrated that for over a decade, estate governance had suffered from competing lines of administrative authority. Informal verbal permissions handed out behind closed doors had routinely overridden formal written protocols. The private administrative office linked to Tom Parker Bowles had operated under the genuine conviction that their access enjoyed full authorization through long-standing internal custom. At the same time, estate wardens and legal custodians had operated under the belief that those exact same actions amounted to an unprecedented breach of constitutional governance. It was a total institutional failure. Two parallel systems of authority had coexisted side by side for years without ever formally acknowledging each other until a single misplaced log entry forced them into a catastrophic head-on smash. Outside the palace walls, public fury had reached fever pitch. Front pages speculated daily on impending arrests, secret police probes, and bitter feuds threatening to tear the royal family apart. Commentators demanded instant public statements urging the palace to clarify whether the monarch's private land had been improperly exploited for personal gain. Yet inside the quiet corridors, the emotional fallout of the scandal was exacting a devastating toll. The personal tension between King Charles and Prince William was visible to anyone entering the private quarters. William stood firm on his stance that institutional accountability must trump family protection. He pushed for sweeping, public administrative reforms that would strip all non-working relatives of informal privileges, standardizing estate access under strict public rules. King Charles, caught squarely between his duties as sovereign and his loyalty as a husband and father, faced an impossible emotional dilemma. Enacting William's aggressive reforms straight away would look to the public like a tacit admission of guilt, publicly humiliating Queen Camilla's son and casting a permanent cloud over the family. Pushing back against those reforms, however, risked triggering a deep, permanent fracture with his son and successor while leaving the institution exposed to future governance scandals. Every chat between the sovereign and his heir was reportedly tense, brief, and weighed down by an agonizing emotional chill. The atmosphere inside the palace was no longer defined by royal splendor, but by sheer isolation. Longtime employees described working in an environment where every document was checked twice, every phone call met with suspicion, and warm personal friendships were replaced by cold legal precision. The legal team delivered their final recommendations to the sovereign. They advised against making public statements concerning criminal acts since zero evidence of criminality had been uncovered. Instead, they proposed a total overhaul of the private estate management setup, dissolving the secondary administrative framework and stripping away all informal access perks across every royal property. It was an administrative triumph for Prince William's vision of a modern, transparent monarchy, but it came at a bitter personal price. As the late-night meeting drew to a close, advisors packed their leather briefcases, ready to draft the formal internal directives that would permanently reshape how royal estates were run. The tension in the study slowly began to lift, replaced by a cold, quiet resignation. The internal review was officially over. The structural weaknesses had been spotted, and the institutional overhauls set in motion. Yet as the senior legal counsel closed the final dossier and slid it back into his briefcase, he paused, his gaze fixing on a single handwritten note pinned to the very back cover of the file. The investigation had wrapped up and the institutional answers had been written down, But one single unanswered question remained, waiting in the shadows to challenge everything they thought they had just sorted out. A lone yellowed scrap of paper slipped free from the bottom of the archive folder, fluttering softly down to rest beside the king's velvet slippers. The legal counsel froze, his hand hovering mid-air above his leather case. The room held its breath. Prince William stepped forward, bending down to retrieve the forgotten page. It was a private, handwritten memo dated years before the estate controversy ever broke out. As his eyes swept across the faded ink, the entire foundation of the scandal shifted in a heartbeat. The document was neither an approval form nor a clearance slip. It was a direct, confidential directive penned in the handwriting of a senior sovereign official, explicitly stating that control over private estate access was meant to stay deliberately ambiguous to safeguard delicate diplomatic arrangements. In that single moment, the entire narrative collapsed into a far more intricate reality. The fierce accusations, the sensational rumors of criminal wrongdoing, and the bitter claims that Tom Parker Bowles or any other non-working relatives had unlawfully seized royal authority were exposed as the product of a massive historical misunderstanding. The controversy had never stemmed from criminal intent or willful defiance. It was the predictable, explosive fallout from conflicting interpretations of an intentionally hazy system of authority built decades earlier. The core mystery powering the royal drama was solved. Yet it offered no easy comfort. It laid bare a monarchy whose greatest enemy was not external malice, but its own long history of quiet compromises and blurred boundaries. Yet here is the detail that changes everything. The handwritten directive discovered at the base of the dossier bore an official tracking stamp proving it was merely the first page of a two-part confidential order. The second page, containing the specific names of individuals granted total, unchecked access across all Crown properties, is missing from the royal archives. Someone removed that second page from Windsor Castle just 48 hours before the audit kicked off. And the identity of that person, alongside the contents of that document, remains completely unknown. The public debate over accountability, governance, and the protection of the monarch's private interests will continue to echo across newsrooms and living rooms across the globe. Trust within the royal household has been shattered. Administrative boundaries have been redrawn. And the emotional chasm between a father and his son remains a silent scar behind closed palace doors. But the real question is not whether Tom Parker Bowles crossed the line. The real question is who knew the line was blurred on purpose, who profited from keeping it that way, and who walked out of Windsor Castle holding the one piece of paper that could finally reveal the truth.